is the first contact. Brief, barely 10 minutes, but a conversation all the same, and it happened in New Delhi, India. How significant is it? What role would India have played in nudging the two superpowers to talk to and not at each other? What does this say about Indian diplomacy and India's strategic neutrality despite both global pressure and domestic barbs? I'm Gaurav Sawant. We get you much more on this big story on India First. But first, as always, the headlines. Bribegate bomb explodes in Karnataka. BJP MLA's son caught red-handed accepting 40 lakh rupees bribe. 8 crore rupees recovered from the MLA's house. Congress calls Bomai corruption ka king. Rahul Gandhi criticizes Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his government at the Cambridge University, accuses the centre of spying on him, says the Modi government is hampering democracy in India. External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar chairs the Quad Squad in New Delhi. Foreign ministers of 4 nations underline commitment to free and open Indo-Pacific in a move to checkmate China. Day after India-China G20 handshake, India sends a strong message. Army releases pictures of soldiers playing cricket in Galwan, 4 kilometers from where the 2020 clash took place. No stopping Baba ka bulldozer in Prayagraj in Uttar Pradesh. The house of a third Umeshpal murder accused Atiq Ahmed's aide razed to the ground. For the first time since the Russia-Ukraine conflict, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov made contact on the sidelines of the G20 in New Delhi. Moscow says Washington DC sought this contact. It was brief, barely 10 minutes, but the two spoke face to face. Is this a positive first step? And could this mean the spring offensive may be stopped and a settlement found through dialogue? Prime Minister Narendra Modi has repeatedly said the era of war is over. Can India help nudge the two superpowers to talk and find a negotiated settlement? India Today's Foreign Affairs editor Geeta Mohan with our top story.
Over a year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Over a year since this war has threatened to expand into a global conflict. Over a year since temperatures between the US and Russia have hit critical levels. And it's India that's facilitated a break in the ice. That's right, it was on the sidelines of the G20 foreign ministers meet in Delhi that the foreign ministers of the US and Russia finally spoke. The 10-minute contact, not quite a full-fledged meeting, is a major diplomatic milestone, especially since the US and Russia have been engaged in an escalating standoff over Ukraine, even brandishing their nuclear weapons at each other in the year gone by. It's understood that it was Secretary Antony Blinken's office that sought the meeting with his Russian counterpart. But the Russian side agreed to only a brief contact, where the two foreign ministers could chat. But what exactly happened in those crucial 10 minutes? It's unclear what Russia's Lavrov said, but the US State Department did brief reporters that Secretary Blinken informed his Russian counterpart that the US would continue to defend Ukraine for as long as it takes, and also urged Russia to rejoin the START nuclear arms control treaty. From the get-go at the G20 meet, Lavrov has been aggressive, taking every opportunity to lash out at the US and the West in general.
If you believe that the United States has the right to declare a threat to its national interest any place on earth, like they did in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, 10,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, and they have the right to do so, and you don't ask them any questions.
While the United States of America and Russia are at war with each other over the Russia-Ukraine war, it is in India that Blinken and Lavrov found time to speak with each other. A very brief contact, but one that is going to be significant in days to come. It just shows that India is not just a global player, it's also a peacemaker.
That the diplomatic breakthrough happened on Indian soil is no small feat. Much to the humiliation of critics of India's pragmatic neutrality on the Ukraine war, India has managed to play host to what most thought was impossible, a break in the ice between the US and Russia. And however brief that contact was, it comes with hopeful assurance that only diplomacy and not war is the solution to the Ukraine crisis. With Geeta Mohan in Delhi, Bureau Report, India Today.
How significant is this contact? Joining me on India First, Ambassador Meera Shankar, former Indian ambassador to the United States of America. Professor Brahma Chilani is a strategic thinker, author and commentator. My first question is to India Today's Shiv Arur. Shiv, you've been speaking to your sources in the Ministry of External Affairs and strategic analysts. How significant is this contact and the fact that it was in the national capital?
You know, Gaurav, war and diplomacy are always, always shape-shifting, complex issues. So, I don't want to overplay it or underplay it. But let me just start off by saying that, from many countries, leaders, to strategic affairs experts, to journalists, both foreign and Indian, to experts on diplomacy, to all manner of commentators everywhere in the world who had criticized India and taken India to task over its, neutrality on the Ukraine issue, are, mildly humiliated today, to say the least, because it is here on Indian soil that icebreaker has happened between the United States and Russia. Sure, it was a 10-minute contact, as it were, not a full-fledged meeting between Secretary Blinken and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. But in those 10 minutes, stands enshrined the first contact between these two superpowers, whose engagement or lack thereof has basically threatened to drown the entire world in conflict over what's happening in Ukraine. Let's not forget that nuclear weapons have been brandished at each other in the last 1 year by these two countries, Russia and the United States. And it is here on Indian soil. There have been opportunities before this in the last 1 year, but it is at the G20 foreign ministers meet in India that Secretary Blinken and Minister Lavrov actually met for those 10 minutes.
Ambassador Shankar, what do you make of this contact, the conversation and the place of this meeting in the national capital?
Well, it's significant because there's been a rupture in communications between the US and Russia since Ukraine. So it's significant in that context, but I wouldn't read too much into it because it was a very fleeting meeting. We don't know what the Russians said because there's been no briefing from their side on this. But we do know what the US said, and essentially there were three issues which the US stressed. One was that Russia should rejoin the New START treaty, which it has suspended. Two, that Russia should cooperate in reactivating the grain shipments from Ukraine and the agreement that was reached earlier in this regard. And three, that the US supports Ukraine for the long haul and as long as it takes. So three messages from the US to Russia. The Russian side, of course, on these three issues, I think they have said that they can't cooperate with the US in inspecting their sites, nuclear sites, because the US is passing on information to Ukraine to target sites in Russia. Secondly, Russia says that the grain agreement can only be activated if Russia is also provided access to send its shipments, including fertilizers and grain. And of course, there is every sense that Russia is readying for a spring offensive, as is Ukraine for its own offensive. So I don't see things
Okay.
winding down right now.
Fair enough.
But I do see, some, openings for communication which were not there before.
Is that
Maybe
significant,
that
Professor
can-
Brahmachilani? Is that significant? At least there's an opening, at least there's a contact. And does that vindicate, in your view, India's stance of strategic neutrality?
Well, India's strategic neutrality has held India in good stead. The Americans tried to bully India into discarding its neutrality. They failed. Any government in New Delhi would have pursued the same course of action as the Modi government has done, because in neutral India has more leeway. It can protect its interests better. So very wisely, the government of India has pursued strategic neutrality. But there's a very important thing that is happening. And this is underscored by the fact that the German chancellor is going suddenly to Washington to have a meeting with President Biden, because now there are increasing questions swirling about the end game in Ukraine. And Western leaders are beginning to search for a roadmap for ending the conflict in Ukraine. Why? There are two reasons. One, that the goals that the Western leaders had outlined at the beginning, a year ago when the war began, Biden, for example, publicly said that he wanted economic collapse in Russia. He wanted regime change in Russia. The fact is that Putin has become stronger domestically since the war began. And Russia now holds 1/5 of Ukraine, nearly 1/5 of Ukraine. And there's no way that you can force Russia to retreat from the sizable territories it has annexed in Ukraine's east and south.
Yes.
And the second thing that is troubling Western thinkers and leaders is that the West's substantial aid to Ukraine is proving costly for the aid givers. If you look at the US, the steep price tag of the war is not just threatening to drain America's war funds, but is also depleting America's weapons arsenals. Weapons arsenals at a time when the China threat is looming larger. The high cost of the war for the US has intensified concerns in the US Congress, and is threatening the strong bipartisan consensus in favor of continued aid flow to Ukraine. And there are unconfirmed reports of lost and diverted Western weapons.
Yes.
Because Ukraine is a very corrupt country. So given this background, and given the fact that there has been a shift in the debate, for example, in January, the RAND Corporation, which is a very influential government-funded think tank, they presented a public report advocating that the US should shift its strategy on Ukraine. Instead of seeking a long war to weaken Russia, it advised American policymakers to seek a roadmap to end the conflict, because a long war would weaken America and actually cement a Russia-China axis against the US.
And would
so it would
strengthen
be detrimental.
China. Absolutely. Absolutely. Ambassador Meera Shankar, given this scenario, given that realization dawns that a long war may just be counterproductive for America and Europe, can India play a bigger role in getting the superpowers to talk to each other and not at each other, and perhaps look for solutions through dialogue? Are we trusted by both sides?
I think we are trusted by both sides, but it depends on the kind of influence we would be able to bring to bear. I mean, in the past, you've had efforts, by Turkey and also Israel to try to bring about some kind of a negotiated settlement in the beginning of the conflict, in fact. And reports are that an agreement was actually reached between Russia and Ukraine, that Ukraine would stay neutral, and then Russia would vacate the territories it had occupied newly, and that there would be security guarantees from all countries for Ukraine, including from Russia. So this was broadly the outline, but then it's believed that Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister of UK, paid an unscheduled visit to Ukraine, essentially to scuttle this peace deal. And since then, it's been going down a very slippery slope where they've got locked into a conflict where Ukraine clearly cannot achieve its ultimate objective, its stated objective of driving Russia out of every inch of territory that it occupies.
Neither Ukraine nor the United States of America to weaken Russia further. But Professor Chilani, can this 10-minute contact, and if this is, as Ambassador Meera Shankar said, at least there was some contact, can it lead to full-fledged negotiations or moving forward on negotiations, given that all sides perhaps realize that their end game, at least the one that they sought, they're unable to achieve?
The very fact that they met is very significant. Even if they met for 10 minutes and they met at Blinken's request, shows that there is recognition on both sides that only diplomacy can bring an end to this bloody conflict. The war has reached a stalemate. The grinding nature of the war on the ground reflects this fact. And when a war reaches a stalemate, the next step should be an armistice, a ceasefire. So now negotiations have to be held quietly. They cannot be held publicly. Whatever was discussed between Blinken and Lavrov must have been about war and peace, must have been what next needs to be done. The fact that the Americans sought such a meeting, the fact that for a year the US had left diplomacy out of the picture, they had put all their resources in funneling arms to Ukraine. Biden had left no space for diplomacy, and then suddenly they wanted a meeting with Lavrov, indicates that Washington is beginning to realize that its objectives are not going to be realized, that the war is going to be very costly for the US and for American interests, and that it's time now to think of an armistice. Same thing happened in the Korean Peninsula in the early 1950s.
India played a role.
There was a stalemate by 1951, but the war continued for 2 more years because either side wanted to be seen as seeking an armistice. But eventually an armistice was agreed and Korean Peninsula was partitioned. Same thing will happen in Ukraine. There will be a partition. The areas that Russia has annexed, those areas will remain with Russia, and there will be a ceasefire, but the ceasefire would not mean the end of the conflict.
Is that also your appreciation, Ambassador Shankar?
It'll be a frozen conflict.
It's probably going to end up as a frozen conflict where, if both sides eventually feel that they can't improve their position. Right now, both are trying to improve their position. Each feels that they could gain by intensifying fighting over the next couple of months.
Fair enough.
But if that doesn't happen, then you're going to see efforts to, halt at least the conflict.
Which is what India has been saying all along.
De facto division of Ukraine, which may not be accepted by Ukraine, but would be on the ground.
And I want to now quickly come to the other story that I wanted a response from both of you on is Congress MP and leader Rahul Gandhi, who was at the Cambridge University. He's now in the eye of a storm over his comments on Kashmir, Pulwama, and of course China. Listen into Rahul Gandhi for a moment.
So we are going through all the states, and Kashmir is a state which is insurgency prone, right? There's a lot of violence. There's been quite a lot of violence for many years. In fact, that picture there is me putting flowers on the spot where almost 40 soldiers were killed by a car bomb some years back. So we arrive in Kashmir, and Kashmir is this so-called violent place. It's a hybrid. It is exactly like the United States as far as the cooperation is concerned, And then it's got a magic trick in it, which is that inside the corporation is what they call the instrument of the people, what we call the Communist Party of China, right? And this does something fundamental. What it does is it allows the Communist Party of China to have a full monopoly on information in the country, which the government of the United States doesn't have, or the government of India doesn't have, or the government of most other countries doesn't have, because there's a separation between the state and the corporation. And this gives them a huge advantage in artificial intelligence. It gives them a huge advantage in all sorts of, in cyber warfare, etc., etc. The infrastructure that you see in China, the railways, the airports, the dams, they are actually, in the Chinese mind, they are emerging from nature. They're emerging from the power of the river, and they're, in a sense, China sees itself as a force of nature, right? And is embedded in nature. Whereas the West, America, does not see itself as embedded in nature. It sees itself as placed on top of nature. Okay? Now this completely changes how you think about things. And this explains, to me at least, why the Chinese would be so interested in harmony.
Professor Chilani, what do you make of Rahul Gandhi's appreciation of the Chinese Communist Party and China?
Amazing statement. Betrays a lack of maturity. Just because China has information control, according to Rahul Gandhi, it has mastery of artificial intelligence. And just because it's building dams and other monumental projects, it's in harmony with nature. I don't see the logic in what he said and how he moved from Kashmir and the killing of 40 soldiers in a car bomb, he said. It was not a car bomb that killed 40 soldiers, it was a Pakistani scripted attack on Indian soldiers that killed 40 Indian Jawans.
And when he says insurgency, just a quick 30-second, sir. When he says insurgency, is it ignoring the role of Pakistan's state-sponsored radical Islamist terror?
Of course. Of course. The way he described the killing of the 40 Indian soldiers in a car bomb, without saying who was behind that car bombing, who was responsible. We know, the world knows, the American government has admitted that the attack was scripted by Pakistani intelligence. And then he uses the word insurgency, not terrorism, about the situation in Kashmir. And then he moves from Kashmir to something very weird.
Yeah, I want to bring Ambassador Shankar also, Meera Shankar also to respond to this. Ambassador Meera Shankar, what's your reading of Rahul Gandhi's take on China? When he talks about China is interested in harmony, Chinese actions in Doklam, Galwan, Demchok, Depsang, that recent video of Yangtze, does that indicate China wants harmony?
Well, I think, I haven't really seen the whole speech, so I don't know what context this has been made in. But I'm sure that this does not refer to the Chinese intrusions, on which his party and he have been quite vocal, actually, saying that we haven't done enough to drive China out of those encroachments. Clearly, there are different political perspectives on issues. And I think that differences of opinion, in a sense, help to make a more, a more sturdy policy making. Because if everybody agrees with the same views, then I'm not sure that we are not double guessing each other and sometimes striking a different note, even where we may not agree with what is said.
Okay.
I think has to be not condemned per se, but you have to try to understand that perspective, even if you don't agree with it.
Fair enough, and I will let that be the last word on this part of the show. Ambassador Meera Shankar and Professor Brahmachalani, as always, many thanks for joining me here on this India First special. A quick break, Business Today with Udayan Mukherjee on the other side of these messages. Stay with us.
India Today Conclave 2023, March 17th and 18th, New Delhi. Listen to Janvi Kapoor, Malaika Arora, Anita Sengupta, Abha